Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Piss. This is a Ukraine war news update. I guess it's going to be the first part thereof for the 17th of February 2025 because I'm recording this very late at night. And I'll release it a little bit later, probably in the morning UK time, before my hits and losses video. But I want to, this is essentially the second half of what was already a massive video concerning US peace plans and the US approach to Ukraine at the moment, and the talk about a Saudi Arabia meeting between between Russia and the US. Not quite sure who it's going to be. That is looking like it's not having Ukraine or Europe present, and then there are rumors that Ukraine might be there, and then it all seems to be a little bit confusing. None of the breaking news update that Keir Starmer has announced that UK troops will be a part of peacekeeping force. He's the first international leader to. Do you know what? If I was a leader and had a picture like that done, I'd be like, thanks, photographer. That is an awesome picture. Just like that's exactly what you want if you're a prime minister. Anyway. So I think this was a good move by Keir Starmer. I think it's strong positioning for the UK. Pretty happy that this has taken place. I think it was an inevitable anyway, and I think it was clever to get ahead of the curve on that one. Just a bit of reaction to that. Oliver Carroll saying, I've been wondering if Britain, arguably the most stable major European democracy right now, would step up to leadership. I wasn't sure Starmer had the stomach for risk. This is bold and brave. Which I think is absolutely on point. Interesting that he said that. And then actually Edward Hunter Christie saying this move by the UK announcing readiness to deploy troops to Ukraine as a future security guarantee is brilliant, courageous and timely. It will change the entire conversation. This is the fourth time since January 2022 that the UK has led with a pivotal move that helps Ukraine. The conversation among allies was in dire straits. The US was signalling abandonment of Europe and Ukraine to their own devices, and a triple red line of no NATO, no troops, and no Article 5 guarantee. If there would be any European troops, something had to move. The UK is a first mover. It may well be the case that cynics inside the Trump administration, as well as Moscow, were hoping that the Europeans would chicken out. They would have spiraled downwards quickly, giving Trump every excuse to further downgrade the transatlantic bond. The UK decision cuts through this. I don't know if that's overselling it a little bit. My hot take for the UK is doing this is for Ukraine security, Europe security, UK security. That's exactly what he said in the article, and crucially so that the transatlantic bond survives. The UK owes its historical survival to it. It doesn't envisage its security without it, but the UK also doesn't envisage its security without Europe, and will never so disinterest itself of Europe's fortunes as to walk away as a mere airstrip won for American power. The UK will always seek a balancing act and a pivotal act between the two sides of the Atlantic. It is existential, and that kind of goes towards this article in The Guardian, which is UK hopes to be a bridge between Europe and Trump's US minister says. So this is Jonathan Reynolds, minister, talking about the UK being that bridge, and that could, if that there are different kind of trying to game out the situation, different approaches. One approach is that the UK should stand really strong, or any leader should stand strong. Trump kind of backs down to strong leaders, and he admires strong leaders, and it's a bit like Putin. There's some similarity there, that if you stand up to Putin or Trump, then actually you'll get the most out of it. If you acquiesce to them and try and appease them, then they will just take advantage of you. And so there are some saying that UK shouldn't try and be this kind of not obsequious, but some kind of genuflecting, appeasing entity that tries to act between like a warring Europe and US, like rhetorically speaking, or in fact economic wars are looming, that actually we should stand strong. So, difficult to know what the UK should do and whether it will adopt a very conciliatory approach or a hardline approach. But it's good that Starmer's announced the troops, but I think that he will probably go to the US and try and maybe kiss the ring of Trump. And I think it could be a missed opportunity there. But anyway, Edward Hunter Christie says The UK will always seek a balancing act and a pivotal act between the two sides of the Atlantic. It is existential. This commitment will change the conversation in Washington. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said no Article 5 to shield putative European forces in Ukraine. He didn't say no US protection. The gap is there, and it's likely that Starmer believes that should UK troops stationed in Ukraine come under a future Russian attack, the US would not remain passive. Even under Donald Trump, this may seem optimistic after everything we've heard and seen in the last week. And this isn't over. But it's one thing for Trump and co to abandon Ukraine. It's quite another to hypothetically watch passively as British troops and other European troops battle in Ukraine against a third Russian invasion. Trump wants any deal he'd make to last for his entire time in office. Starmer's promise gives him a pathway, and it also gives other Europeans a pathway to also step forward. Expect others to also make similar commitments. Not every European state, of course, but a coalition of the willing. This is a conditional promise, and caveated. Starmer should have left out the if necessary clause. Ideally, we're not talking for at least now about going in before a putative peace deal, but the power is in how the signal modifies all possible futures. Russia is immediately in a very tight spot. The deployment isn't now, so it can't hit the troops because they're not there. If he did so right now, he'd be hitting Britain and Article 5 and the end of Putin's adventurism. And this all throws a perfect spanner in the works of America's rushed peace deal negotiations with Putin. Whatever one believes Trump was about to do, one assumes he was about to sell Ukraine down a river. This becomes massively harder to do now because Moscow will slam the door. Who cares about future NATO membership if there are British and other European troops inside Ukraine? It doesn't become unimportant, but it becomes a lot less important and crucially less binary and therefore less reliable to cause a political failure through commitment failure. The best case scenario for Ukraine has always been a coalition of the willing on its territory. Ideally for Ukraine, not after a ceasefire, but right now. We don't have the first best for Ukraine, but we're looking at second best, a future promise of that same thing. The taboo is broken. What happens to the trajectory of the war after this? It isn't in the bag because a likely effect is negotiation failure with Putin, whose first impulse will be to continue his aggression because the post-war picture is one he won't want to have. If that is so, the war extends, and it is then up to all of our nations to twist the neck of the Russian economy, to increase military aid to Ukraine, and to sharpen our own swords for what may come next. With that trajectory, no respite for Putin, who is losing over 1,000 men a day. The playing field is open again, all to play for, and while much can happen, that could be very negative. Victory is possible again. So that's a pretty bullish statement or set the thread in response to Keir Starmer announcing that. So I just thought I'd share that with you. We're just going to move on. One thing, just to remind you that Belarus, the US is lifting sanctions on Belarus. And today I was like, what is going on there? It looks like Trump is trying to be very positive and appeasing towards another dictator, Lukashenko. And someone pointed out, or a number of you actually pointed this out today, that there's no coincidence that the lifting the sanctions is on potash. And actually, this is Trump using sanctions on Belarus to have a dig at Canada. It's quite incredible. So the lifting of sanctions against potash from Belarus. Canada is the largest producer of potash. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers. Potash is an essential component of fertilizers. Followed by, Canada. Trump seems to indirectly attack Canada. So there will be, in a trade war with Canada, Canada will 100%, and it's been mentioned, put a tariff on potash. So by lifting sanctions on Belarus, it means that the US will have a way around putting tariffs on Canada and mitigating against retaliatory tariffs from Canada because they can source that potash from Belarus. Sod the fact that Belarus is sanctioned and are complicit in the war against Ukraine. Sod that, it doesn't matter, because we just want to get our potash and we also want to put tariffs on Canada. So that is a fascinating insight into the mind of the Trump administration. Now, talking about sanctions is interesting. This was pointed out by Viggo Holmsen. joint G7 foreign ministers statement from February 2025. This is published on the 15th. There's just some interesting, if I do a Control F and look for NATO here, then we should, why is that not coming up? Yeah, it's a bit weird. Anyway, Control F isn't working. Down towards the bottom here, there was some interesting claims concerning sanctions, and no, it wasn't to NATO. It was actually sanctions. Let me find that. Yeah, here it is. Sorry, I was looking for the wrong word. It's not NATO, it's sanctions. So talk about sanctions. Any new additional sanctions, said the G7 meeting, so this is their statement, any new additional sanctions after February should be linked to whether the Russian Federation enters into real good faith efforts to bring an enduring end to the war against Ukraine that provides Ukraine with long-term security and stability as a sovereign independent country. The G7 members reaffirmed their unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. But it looks like new sanctions will be brought in line with trying to force Russia to enter into a deal. So we'll see how that goes. But you do worry that there will also be the potential for the US to lift sanctions, particularly US, on Russia and use that as leverage for their own ends, kind of like we've seen them lift sanctions on Belarus for their own ends. And I find that quite disheartening. Now, let's listen to Zelensky here in his wide-ranging interview with Kristen Welker from Meet the Press on NBC.
Thing that President Trump said this week. He did not say yes when he was asked if he sees Ukraine as an equal member in the peace process. He did say later that Ukraine would have a seat at the table. Have you been given any assurances that Ukraine will have an equal seat at the negotiating table?
So I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses. And we are thankful for all the support, unity between USA, in USA, around Ukraine support, bipartisan unity, bipartisan support. We're thankful for all of this, but there is no any leader in the world who can really make a deal with Putin without us, about us.
Can't be about us without us. It's a really famous maxim, that, and it is so apt here. Quite right, says Piers Morgan. Everyone criticising him for saying this would say the complete opposite if it was their own country in Ukraine's position. And I don't know who would be criticising him apart from maybe MAGA people. It's just absolutely unconscionable that you can expect Ukraine not to be at discussions concerning the future of Ukraine. Like, imagine you were just about to lose your house and you and people were arguing over your house and you were not invited to the discussions for whatever. You'd be like, this is my, I need to, what the hell, this is my, it's not your house, this is my house. If I'm going to lose, I need to be at these discussions. Like, do you know what I mean? It's just insane that Ukraine wouldn't be at these discussions. So let's listen to Pete Hegseth on Fox, not Pete Hegseth, sorry, Mike Walls, the National Security Advisor on Fox News.
Okay, but given the cost that the Ukrainian people have paid, why would they not have a direct seat at the table, especially if Zelensky says whatever you come up with, he's not going to feel bound by unless they're actively, directly part of these talks?
Well, look, the Ukrainian people have fought valiantly. They have seen entire cities destroyed. The United States and Europe has supported this effort, but the United States unquestionably has borne the brunt of that support over the years. But now President Trump is clear.
So basically, he's like, blah, 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 blah. Ukraine has died, borne the brunt. We're saying the US has borne the brunt. And actually, US versus Europe, you could have an argument, as we have done before. But he's really not properly answered that question. Like, who's borne the major brunt, the US or Ukraine? I wonder. Oh, yeah. How many US people have died compared to Ukrainians? Yeah, I think the Ukrainians have probably borne the brunt of the war, right? So it's rather harsh. You say, why don't they get a seat at the table? Well, we're the ones that have borne the brunt of the war.
Over the years, but now President Trump is clear it needs to come to an end, and there are key tenets that will drive these negotiations. Number one, it has to be a permanent end to the war, not a temporary end to the war. Number two, this can't be ended on the battlefield. This has turned into a World War I style meat grinder of human beings. Number three, I talked about how the structure of our aid has to.
Okay, but
etc., etc., etc. It doesn't answer the question. Like, no, what, why do they not get a seat at the table? That is not acceptable. As Timothy Milovanov says, that's a lot of crap. No one wants a permanent peace more than the Ukrainians. In fact, it's the only real outcome Ukrainians are asking for. The rest is secondary. The problem is that Russia has betrayed every deal it made with Ukraine and its allies, like the US. So Ukrainians will not trust any deal made in their absence. The US knows it, Trump knows it, and why then make negotiations without Ukraine? Trump is worried that he will fail to secure any reasonable deal with Putin, and so he must have someone else to blame, Zelensky in Ukraine, because Ukraine will see through the BS deal offered and will refuse. Trump knows this, Zelensky knows this, Waltz knows this, everyone who isn't stupid and willing to be honest to herself knows this. The way Trump is going about the deal, there will be no deal. So, yeah, lots of people having consternation that Ukraine have not been offered to a seat at the table. And just... well, no, actually, I won't bother going into that one. Just to let you know that at the Munich Security Conference, it wasn't just JD Vance and those sort of people there representing the US. People like Representative Jason Crow, Democrat, was there with others actually pitching, that there are other people in the United States who are fully in support of Ukraine, etc., etc. Now, talking about the peace deal or the discussions coming up in Saudi Arabia, we wonder who it will be between. Cass here says, just on my thread, I'm going to make a prediction. I see Trump is going to Saudi Arabia to meet with Russia for his peace summit. Why Saudi Arabia? For months and months, the Saudis have been saying that they are going to increase oil production because Russia is exceeding their limits under OPEC +1, undercutting them. Last time this happened, Trump brokered a deal between the Russians and the Saudis to keep production low, to keep gas prices up, because he said it hurt US oil companies' profits keeping it low. Yes, he says he wants to lower gas prices, but he also said, and that's petrol for those in the UK, but he also said that he wanted to lower the price of food, and it's increased. Russia cannot afford to have low gas prices. The Saudis are tired of listening to their lies. So I think Russia asked Trump to go to Saudi Arabia to advocate for them not to increase production, which will prolong the war and be the opposite of what he promised he'll do, as usual. We'll see if my theory holds true and if Trump succeeds. So it's interesting that Saudi Arabia is the place, and whether there will be some shenanigans concerning oil and whatnot. Okay, so that's all kind of bits and pieces leading towards Europe's response to the peace plans. I'd like to share, says Anton Gerashenko, some excellent points made by Margus Sakner, the foreign minister for Estonia. I think that reality bites right now. I think that for many countries in Europe, this is an existential question. And our relationship with the US is very strong and remains very strong, but it is very different right now. So we need to stand up as well and understand that no one else is coming to solve our problems in Europe. So we need to do it ourselves, and the US will back us up. I don't want to use the words wake up call. We have had wake up calls since 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, but I feel a different energy here in Europe as well. We have a new initiative I cannot publish yet because we discussed that in the morning, what we can rapidly do as a next step to support Ukraine. So this is the interesting part here. Like, Europe is doing stuff, and they're talking about stuff, and they're having an emergency meeting about how to deal with Saudi Arabia and with the US sort of strong arm in these peace plans. They do have a plan, but he can't talk about it yet. It involves funds, military support, frozen Russian assets. Interesting, $300 billion of assets. I do think that we can actually make a decision. 300 billion, it's a lot of money. Wow. So, and that's Europe's call, by the way, because that's in Euroclear in Belgium, right? It's not in the US. So Europe has a potential to blow out the water American support for Ukraine. If that $300 billion is agreed upon by Europe, you might suddenly have Ukraine going, oh, do you know what, US? Thanks for all of your offers to help. We do need your military support, but do you know what? We'll buy it off you. Trump's not going to say no to that, right? But he'll be kind of powerless if $300 billion can be released. That sustains Ukraine in the war for a lot longer, and it puts Russia under a lot of pressure. And if the war is, I don't know, turning slightly, if Russia have culminated and you go through a period of Ukraine being able to put the pressure on Russia militarily and economically, assuming the sanctions stay in place, then actually you've got that 6 to 8 months that I keep talking about of early negotiations. By that I mean the negotiations taking place on the battlefield and in the economies. And if you get 6 to 8 months of that, then that's the right time to go to negotiations with Russia. Europe can facilitate that. Europe can pull the rug out from under Trump's feet. That is fascinating. Sorry it's taken me so long to get to that, but that is kind of like the core points of this video. Kaja Kallas has said, we are concluding the Munich conference with discussion, this is a couple of days ago, discussion among the EU foreign ministers who are still in Munich. Europe is resolutely united in supporting Ukraine and strengthening our own defence. We will soon propose new initiatives to move forward, again hinting at what you just heard. According to Bloomberg, European officials are working on a new support package for Ukraine. The Trump administration aims for a ceasefire by Easter, but some doubt quick results from Russian negotiations and expect an agreement by the year's end. And that big support package could well be impressive. There's talk that, well, it's also interesting that that's a European support package. So what does that look like? Is it anything to do with the European Peace Facility? You know, how does that look? We're used to bilateral military aid packages, but we don't normally see too many military aid packages coming from Europe directly. So interesting. Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb has called for an urgent EU summit on Ukraine to develop a common position on Europe's role in the negotiations, right? Quote, only the EU can make decisions on security, Ukraine's membership in the EU, or its restoration. So part of the discussion, the peace discussion in Saudi Arabia or anywhere, if part of the discussion is about whether Ukraine accede to the EU, you know, if Russia are going to say, we don't want that to happen, Europe want that to happen, and Ukraine want that to happen, for Europe not to be at the table is ridiculous, because no one else can decide anything about the accession to the EU, as in, can it happen structurally, what needs to happen, etc., other than the EU, right? So they have to be at the table. Anyway, for this, there must be a place at negotiating tables, says the Finnish Prime Minister. Now, Edward Hunter Chrissy, this is getting on to, again, the core part of this video. Urgent Paris meeting has been called between leaders. It's convened by French President Macron. It would appear to have the following people invited. First reaction, if the EU Commission and Council are there, then, and they should, then HR Kallas should be there as well, ensuring a direct Baltic representation, because it looks like it's going to be France, Germany, Italy, Poland, UK, Netherlands, Denmark, NATO Secretary General, EU Commission and Council Presidents. Denmark, really, can they represent the Baltics and the Nordics enough? So the Baltics, if Kaja Kallas is there, then she could represent the Baltics. So what we're hearing now is Emmanuel Macron, Scholz, Starmer, Meloni, Tusk, Sanchez for Spain, Dick Schoof for the Netherlands, Mette Frederiksen from Denmark, Ursula von der Leyen, Antonio Costa, and NATO's Mark Rutte. What else? The summit is Macron's initiative in reaction to the Trump-Putin phone call and the imminent start of peace talks. Quote, their discussions may then continue in future in other formats with the aim of bringing together all partners interested in peace and security in Europe. This comes after Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, confirmed that Europe won't have a seat at the table of negotiations, but will be consulted through the process. Von der Leyen and Costa are scheduled to meet with Kellogg on Tuesday. This here we have in the article here. Now, actually, there is an interesting point down towards the end of this article. This is in The Guardian, but generally being reported everywhere. Macron convenes European leaders for Ukraine summit amid tension with the US. Now, it's to do with NATO accession and this is where I need to do Control F for NATO. I knew it was somewhere. Yes, so here we have it. Okay, it will discuss, so this meeting will discuss what defense capabilities Europe could provide to give Ukraine credible security guarantees, including a plan for Ukraine to be given automatic NATO membership in the event of a clear ceasefire breach by Russia. The US said there must be devastating consequences for any side that breaches a ceasefire agreement, an element missing from previous Ukraine ceasefires since 2014. Now, when I first read this, I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. I'm really in favour of that. But then I thought, that's a bit pointless. Because, well, I suppose you hold it as a threat over... The idea is that the threat to Russia is if you break the ceasefire, then Ukraine get to join NATO immediately. But then you might as well just have Ukraine in NATO anyway. Just have Ukraine in NATO anyway, and then you don't need... That threat is implicit in Ukraine being in NATO because it's Article 5. Because if you're saying they'll get automatic joining of NATO, then that would assume that Article 5 will be invoked in that, because otherwise there's no point in them being in NATO. If they get to join NATO and you say, and then the next time you're invaded, Article 5 is triggered, but this time with Russia breaking the ceasefire, we won't trigger it, then it's not a threat. So in other words, it has to trigger Article 5 immediately, their accession to NATO, given a ceasefire break. So it just seems a weird thing. Just be in NATO already, and it's exactly the same. So I don't understand why you would have that threat instead of just being part of NATO. And I guess it stops the complications of Ukraine joining NATO and people naysayers, and you kind of kicking it to long grass. And if it has is functionally synonymous with joining NATO, then I guess that you can make arguments that it's at the moment better they're not in NATO. So that could be it. Now, Europe needs a special envoy to take part in the Ukraine peace talks, says again the Finnish president. If there is a negotiating table, I think we need to do something similar to what was done in Kosovo. Europe needs to have a special envoy, said the Finnish president Alexander Stubb. Now, I would actually vote for someone like Alexander Stubb. He's really well versed. His lectures on Russian kind of myths and disinformation and like NATO expansionism and John Mearsheimer and all these kind of realists. He's really knowledgeable, this guy, and he's got great pedigree, great experience already. I think he should be the one, or like I wouldn't have a problem with him being the special envoy. Now, again, Stubb says that Ukraine's membership in the European Union and NATO is non-negotiable, adding that these alliances are essential for ensuring the country's sovereignty and security. I totally agree with that. So there's a lot of people reiterating this point. This is something that Keir Starmer has said, for example. Now, speaking of Keir Starmer, Shashank Joshi, quoting from the BBC, so Keir Starmer, who's expected to attend the summit in Paris, said it was a once-in-a-generation moment for our national security, and it was clear Europe must take a greater role in NATO. And of course, he's also announced the troop commitment. Now, Benjamin Tallis says lots of backroom talk about this in Munich. What's he talking about? Well, Rick Wilson, who is part of the Lincoln Project, isn't he? My message to Europe: build nukes and do it fast. Well, There was lots of talk apparently about nukes at Munich, including in some surprising places. Europe needs to have an effective deterrence, and the nuclear dimension is part of that. We also need other strategic deterrents, rungs on the escalation ladder, conventional and emerging capability. You might have someone like Poland ending up being a nuclear nation. Now, the European Union plans to impose duties on imports of a number of products from the United States that contain pesticides banned in the EU. We have a trade war looming between the EU and the US, and that will certainly get in the way. It will complicate matters concerning peace deals. If you have an economic war between people who are supposed to be on the same side in these peace deals, then that is a massive problem, and it could well happen. Sweden has made support in Ukraine its top policy priority. Grateful to Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson for this and for coordinating with allies on peace through strength. A strong Europe is key. Putin will only lose to strength, Zelensky said after meeting with Ulf Kristersson. So that's good news. On the other hand, Hungary's blocked the first negotiation cluster for Ukraine's EU accession, RMF24. Poland proposed conditions for the fundamentals cluster, requiring 2 roadmaps, but Hungary opposed, demanding Ukraine also present a plan for minority protection. This is something they've done before. They're big on their minority protection. You're wondering whether that's just an excuse or whether they really do care about the Hungarian minorities in Ukraine. And this is absolutely fascinating. Love this from Friedrich Merz. I might not agree with his domestic politics so much, but on Ukraine, he does appear to be very strong, and he's at the moment leading. Interesting polling has come out. Let's have a look at that first. I'm sure I've got it. No, where? Oh, come on, Piers. Surely you have this ready. Okay, found it. So despite a personal visit by US President Vance and Elon Musk putting his full force behind promoting the pro-Russian AfD party, after tonight's debate, and we're just going to look at that, Putin's candidate is now tied for last in post-debate polling regarding this week's coming German election. Wow. So Friedrich Merz comes out with 32%, Olaf Scholz 25%, Robert Habeck from the Green Party 18%, and Alice Weidel 18%. So that is fascinating. Well, actually, so they had a debate tonight, and this was particularly poignant. This is about Ukraine, and I'll let it play just so you can get a sense of his anger here. Friedrich Merz speaking to Alice Weidel. I'm going to play this bit, and then I'll play it and just talk. I will read out the subtitles. Now, unfortunately, I wake up this morning and the next clip that I showed you in the original version of this video was slammed as a copyright infringement. And so I can't show you this. So what did I show you in the original version of this video? First of all, the anger in Friedrich Merz's voice as the leader of the CDU in this leaders debate on German television. He's angry with Alice Weidel, who's the leader of the AfD, for being so outright pro-Russian. She accuses, Germany really, of now not being a neutral state in this war. And Merz really angrily says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm interpreting a lot of the body language as well, saying, look, we're not a neutral state. We're on the side of Ukraine. Of course we're on the side of Ukraine, you dingbat. And it's absolutely brilliant. He's like, no, we are fighting for, we are diplomatically fighting for Ukraine here. And then it's just absolutely brilliant. It shows her to be a pro-Putin puppet, and it shows Germany to be clearly, morally and politically in the right place in supporting Ukraine. It's like, what do you mean we're not wanting to be a neutral state? Anyway, right at the end of that clip, she then says, and we're going to be preventing Germany from providing tourists. So you can't get any more pro-Russian than that. And that's the party that JD Vance, the vice president, that's a party that he is advocating for, that Elon Musk is advocating for, and therefore really that the American government is advocating for very publicly. They are anti-Europe, really anti-EU, and they are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. So it's very difficult to see the US as an ally of Ukraine when very publicly they are siding with a political party in Germany who are not an ally of Ukraine. The US have played their cards. They are no longer an ally. They are a mediator. It is that simple, and it is also shown in this clip because the AfD so obviously support Russia. Okay, moving on to good news that Georgia and the Georgian people are still protesting. A really phenomenal march in Tbilisi. This is probably 2 nights ago now. This is night the 16th, 17th. That was 15th to 16th. So that's really good. 1 night ago. So that's really good news there. So what else do we have? These are propagandists in Russia on national television. Attention, China. Russian propagandists are visibly changing their talking points. Now they're calling China not an ally, but practically accusing it of betrayal. Quote, China is selling drones to Ukraine that kill our soldiers. Of course, the Ukrainians can say the same, exactly the same. The Chinese are blocking our payments. And of course, the Chinese are adhering to secondary sanctions there. So it's interesting that not all is well between the Russians and Chinese. And of course, there will be that recognition within China within Russia, that they have become a vassal state of China. And there will be some resentment there for sure. Anyway, I could go on. That's a 1-minute video talking about propagandists complaining about China. Now, just a little, I'm going to go back to talk about the US. This is stuff that just odds and sods basically from now on, but it's all, I think, super important. So we're going to talk about Pete Hegseth. And I didn't do this in my last video. I cut this out just for time. But Pete Hegseth he spoke at NATO as the Secretary of Defense. Edward Hunter Christie has an analysis. An interesting article in the New York Times based on my experience and on careful observation of Hegseth's speeches. This is a case of barking up the wrong tree. The long and the short of it is Hegseth is not the problem is Trump. Okay, what does he have to say? So a few basics about Hegseth that jumped out at me very clearly. He is enthusiastically loyal to his boss, Donald Trump, as well as to the armed forces of the United States. He made a point of doing physical training with the troops both in Belgium and Poland, and was happy to say so. As the New York Times concedes quite far into the article after the country takedown by a senator, of course Hegseth didn't speak out of turn. He was closely briefed. The unpleasant remarks he made should be taken as reflective of what Trump administration actually thinks. The view that Ukraine is unlikely to get back to its 2013 borders is not uncommon as an analytical conclusion based on current levels of support to Ukraine and given Russia's resources and obsessive fighting effort. Those who support Ukraine with greater moral clarity, myself included, don't say these things like that because objectively it's an open question. We could boost aid to Ukraine and the war could turn, and at some future point the Russian effort could break. But Trump and co are not Ukraine friendly and are at best afraid of Russia and at worst enamored with Putin's tough guy image. It is that predisposition that makes Trump and co settle on negative case scenarios for Ukraine while they also actively seeking to cause them, as in early 2024 in Congress. This is such an important point, this. So if you're pro-Ukraine, you wouldn't say these things out loud. By saying these things out loud, yeah, it's unlikely you're going to get your territory back. And I know Zelensky has said this before. He said, well, at least militarily, it's going to be very difficult for us to get that territory back. But he's playing with his own domestic audience, and he's trying to think 4 moves ahead in that chess game. Here, Pete Hegseth is just like, I don't really care that this will bring about that we're playing our cards too early, because actually we're not really bothered about Ukraine prevailing. It is that predisposition that makes Trump and co settle on negative case scenarios for Ukraine, whilst also actively seeking to cause them. They are not Ukraine friendly, and it's that simple. Hegseth, I believe, was genuine throughout these interventions and had very clear inserts in his speeches that reflected preparation by people who know NATO and European military affairs. In Brussels, Hegseth chose to use a European expression, not the Biden expression, to describe the war. He used the term war of aggression, whereas Biden officials regularly and deliberately used the far softer term war of choice. Hegseth also had a line on No Minsk 3.0. That's not a line he would have come up with by himself without a detailed briefing. In Warsaw, Hegseth was effusive in his praise for Poland's high defence spending. This was solid, professional and genuine US DoD thinking because it's based on the facts. Poland is the alliance's biggest spender in percentage of GDP, higher than the US. Hegseth's remarks about no NATO membership for Ukraine, no US troops in Ukraine and no Article 5 coverage for European troops that would go into Ukraine were not guesswork, but clearly the true self-imposed triple red line of the White House. The triple red line was formulated exactly the way the US intends to generate such guiding principles. For those who want to make predictions, a safer bet is to assume that the triple red line won't change and that JD Vance was at best bluffing about it, at worst lying about it later on. That JD Vance subsequently said some reassuring nonsense should not be taken as evidence that Hegseth didn't know what he was talking about. It was Vance who was reacting to European reactions to Hegseth's words, and he spoke later. A key point in politics is not to try to kill the chief because the chief is too big to fall, but it's okay to bash subordinates. Those who understand the game will bash Hegseth or Rubio or others when they mean Trump. Those who don't understand will think Hegseth is the actual problem, but this is where the loyalty and character of the individuals come into play. It's clear Hegseth genuinely dislikes progressivism, DEI policies and the like, but it's just as clear that he loves the troops and also he has a genuine respect for an ally that works hard like Poland. Trump, on the other hand, is credibly accused of neither understanding nor respecting service personnel, nor veterans, nor America's fallen in previous wars. Hegseth is a nationalist with views many voters find objectionable, but I have no doubt that he has an ethos, whereas Trump has none. I think this is spot on. As Hegseth made clear, from his point of view, the boss will decide everything, whether US troops stay in Europe or not, and even where the final border of Ukraine will be drawn. On the latter, this implies Trump thinks he can legitimately decide that. Hegseth said so in Warsaw. If it were up to him, the US would have even more troops in Poland. Yes, he actually said that, and I'm sure he meant it. On Ukraine, Hegseth doesn't have high emotions, not comparable in any case to how he views Poland, but there's no evidence of Hegseth being a driver of US hostility against Ukraine. That again comes from the top, from Trump himself, with enthusiastic toughness from people like JD Vance. If you remember, my criticisms of Hegseth is not that he's massively anti-Ukraine, it's that he's really not fit for the job. He's like a low-down guy that doesn't have enough knowledge about military strategy, about running a massive organization like the DoD. He's just ill-equipped to do the job. He's maybe good as a Fox News anchor at the weekends, but doing that job, I don't think he's good enough. Also think he's a Christian nationalist, and that's problematic. But nonetheless, some of these points are absolutely salient. Well, all of them, really. So that again comes from the top, from Trump himself, with enthusiastic toughness from people like JD Vance. To conclude, Hegseth didn't actually make too many rookie mistakes. He was reflecting the rookie mistakes of Donald Trump, a man well documented for having had no clue about security questions until his first term, and for having studiously refused to learn anything during his first term. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Right on point. Now, going again back to the Munich Security Conference, but actually this is a kind of a border point that needs to be remembered. This is Timothy Snyder saying, "It was humiliating at Munich to keep hearing Americans holding microphones tell Ukrainians that war is bad. Every Ukrainian listening has lost someone. Some of the Ukrainians listening were combatants who had lost limbs. They know that war is bad. Ukrainians want more than anyone else for the war to end. But just talking with Russia or just signing a piece of paper with Russia will not lead to that conclusion, and Ukrainians know it." And this talks to the point that you keep hearing Trump say it, Mike Waltz say it. Millions of people have died. This is terrible. What a horrible war. It's got to come to an end now. Ukrainians freaking know that. They know it's a terrible war because they've lost their comrades, their brothers, their sisters, their family members, their friends, right? These people know that war is terrible and that many people have died. You don't need to freaking lecture them on that. They want a just peace. They want that not to be in vain. Those deaths should not be in vain. So don't come along and say, it's terrible, all these people have died, therefore we're going to bring it to a conclusion straight away. How about you fricking ask the people who have sacrificed themselves, or friends and family members of those people? Would they want that sacrifice to be just something that goes towards a quick peace that does not benefit Ukraine? Absolutely bloody not. They want a just and lasting peace that does justice to the sacrifice of the Ukrainian people. So don't come on TV and wax lyrical about how many millions of people have died or whatever it is that Trump and his lackeys say. It doesn't wash with the Ukrainians. Now, then it gets doubly insulting that you hear shit like this.
And final question on this. Do you expect Ukraine will have to give up a significant portion of its land? And do we believe that if so, Putin will be done after this?
You know, those are details, and I'm not dismissive of the details. They're important, but I think the beginning here is trust building. It's getting everybody to understand that this war does not belong continuing, that it should end. That's what the president has directed us to do, to negotiate a proper ending of this war. No more death. There's been
I know it's Godwin's law, but invoking Hitler, blah, blah, blah. But you wouldn't sit down and say, well, we need to build trust with Hitler. Building trust with Putin. Putin is just a war criminal and someone that's been known to just break trust the whole time. It's not only naive, but it's also really distasteful, I think, that kind of approach. Anyway, now we're hearing that a Trump official currently dismantling USAID was caught in a secret meeting with a group of pro-Russian separatists in the Balkans. Those he met with are under American sanctions for trying to restart the Bosnian War in the name of Christian nationalism. So ProRepublica is reporting that the rogue episode was one of the first in what diplomats and officials see as a years-long campaign to transform US foreign policy into his own. And now one of the most powerful people in government, Peter Marocco, has the means to do it. So you got the guy that's dismantling USAID, that's in the Balkans at the moment, stopping the fomenting of hostilities, right? He's met with people in the Balkans to foment hostilities. He's a guy shutting down USAID. You're like, just insane. Shashank Joshi, now from The Economist, saying, the only way to, John Halin has said the only way to describe the US policy towards Ukraine right now is predatory. Twisting Ukraine's hand like this, especially with a surprise deal, is basically extortion. And that's talking about the minerals, etc., etc. Completely agree, says Shashank Joshi. The US is extorting Ukraine in a shocking way, and it bodes badly for the sort of deal they might be seeking. Hard to trust their G7 and private rhetoric around robust, durable peace when the administration priority seems to be suck up resources of a partner at war. And we're hearing that. We're hearing from Ukrainian officials saying it feels like we're being carved up like Africa by European colonialists in the 18th century. It is really, the US are not interested in being an ally. They're interested in being a mediator that can take advantage of Ukraine, is my opinion. Now, Vance has said, JD Vance came out and said that the United States would potentially take military action against Russia if they don't come to an agreement. So this is one of the threats. And this is the idea that no one appears to know what's going on in the American administration. I know some of you might think I'm just being overly critical of the Americans, of the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, they are just completely contradicting each other the whole time. And this is why Zelensky comes out and says they've got no clear plan. So you've got JD Vance saying something, and then Trump being asked about this, and Trump not knowing anything about this.
President Vance said that the United States would potentially take military action against Russia if they won't come to an agreement. Do you agree with that stance?
I don't know if that's what he said. I don't think he said that.
I don't know if that's what he said. I don't think he said that. He said that. Like, it's just it's so frustrating. Then, and if you are thinking that again, it's just some liberal sounding off against the Trump administration, blah blah blah, you've got to understand how badly the Trump administration. I was watching the Jonathan Ross show last night, where he was interviewing Brian Cox, who's on Succession, the TV show Succession, the actor Brian Cox, and he's being interviewed, and Jonathan Ross said to him, your two sons in the show, not your real sons, your two sons in the show are actually up for, is it Oscars they're up for, on two different films. And one of the films is about Donald Trump or something to do with Trump's earlier life or something, and the other film is something else. Brian Cox said, Jonathan Ross asked him, who would you vote for? Who's your favourite son? And Brian Cox said, well, to be honest, like this is really good for, he's really good in this film, but this one I won't watch that film because I won't watch anything to do with Donald Trump. I will not watch anything or have anything to do with anything that is connected to Donald Trump. Right? So that is a British actor, famous British actor, saying that, who I presume lives in America and everything, says that. All the audience, and I think a couple of the people on the couch, all the audience at the end of that piece applauded. Mass applause in the audience for Brian Cox slagging off Donald Trump. So for those in America that are like, you live in your little ecosystem where Donald Trump is your hero, just remember that he's not popular outside of the US, and he wasn't in his first. You look at the stats, I've shown you this before, but if you look at the stats of favorability ratings for American president, it went really high for Obama, dropped completely down for Trump, went back up for Biden, and will undoubtedly drop again because the rest of the world generally doesn't really like Donald Trump. Okay, so just and that's factual. This is not me. Go and look at the statistics. They're there. They're very clear. And this kind of reflects the problem. This is extraordinary. As Arnaud Bertrand here says, extraordinary language from the Singapore defense minister when Singapore has always been very US friendly. So this is the words of the Singaporean defense minister. US has now willy-nilly, the image has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. So the Minister of Defense of an ally is now like, the US has gone from this down to this. Extortion. When you talk about extortion, this is the landlord seeking rent. We want payback for everything. We want this, we want that. People are not liking it. And then talking about splitting up NATO, this is from one of my commenters here, Inch6074. I'm asking myself, wasn't this the Russian plan all along? The idea that the US is looking like they could precipitate the splitting up of NATO. Wasn't this the plan all along to split up NATO? It's working either way. The only thing is, if it does, is the European split, it's going to make Europe very weak and easily manipulated and easily defeated militarily, or is it going to make Europe strong for itself? I can't answer that myself. I personally don't think Europe has got itself together. Too many people splitting in all directions. But for Europe's sake, I'd be extremely glad to be proven wrong. But yeah, it's interesting that Russia could have played this exceptionally good long game, whereby, like, you know how we get NATO to destroy itself? Let's get Trump elected and let's see if he does that job for us. Absolutely incredible. And I'm not going to play this, but just it's worth looking at LBC. This is James O'Brien had a phone in where he had people talking from Eastern Europe, people who are living in the UK, phoning in and saying, what the issues are with USAID being cut. I feel like I'm living in a dystopian world. Some really interesting stuff there. One phone caller who was talking about the Balkans and how USAID is incredibly important out there, and now with it being taken away. And this goes back to what I was talking about, that Paul Morocco back here, now, dismantling USAID, and then that causing, he's having meetings with people in the Balkans, and it's all looking rather dodgy. Well, actually, someone phoned into James O'Brien to say, look, it is fomenting a potential, potentially another war out there, and the lack of this soft power. That what's really important about USAID is it's so much cheaper to prevent than to cure. Like, cheaper to give someone a vaccine than to an interesting. Oh no, I won't go down that road. Cheaper to give someone a vaccine than to try and cure them for the disease. Yeah, prevent rather than cure. The money that the US spends on USAID pales into insignificance compared to the money it spends on arming itself and wars around the world. That money, that USAID money, is exceptionally good value for money. Now, of course, you'll find some things that are spent on stuff that you're going to disagree with and some wastage and blah, blah, blah. Every department has that. But I tell you, getting rid of USAID is not good for the world. And someone was saying on one of my threads, it was Gen Consensus actually, saying, you know, well, if the US is stepping back from spending USAID in Europe, why isn't the EU doing this? Surely they can just step up and pay this instead. The EU does that as well. So the EU does an awful lot. When I was in Kherson in Ukraine, I was at the place where, and this will be on my next 10 days in Ukraine video, we were in this village where we were giving some stuff to this kid. Greg Terry knows a family, and they often go and support him. We'd given stuff to this kid, and I was just looking around, and all the windows in that village were being replaced by the EU. There was little labels on them and little posts somewhere with a placard that was the EU doing USAID. So the USAID and the EU, they both do spend just huge amounts of money on soft power. So it's not like, oh, the EU can step up and do that instead. The EU already do that, right? And yeah, so just to make that point. But the US do get a return on that investment. It is incredibly important that we have a stable world for economic and security reasons. And you know, there is a return on investment for investing outside of your borders to get international development from a moral point of view, but also in the US's best interest in how it's viewed in the world, and also not allowing terrorism to boil over, not allowing that nation to be at war, and therefore, you know, it's this game of global influence where the US is now receding from that, and you will see China step in. I would think that USAID funding is money very well spent. Anyway, end of soapbox rant. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon.